depending on, like white grubs can be, depending on the species, they can be in the grub stage, they can be in the beetle stage, the pupal stage, depending on whatever species you're looking at. Sugarcane beetles are the same way. You've got an overwintering adult stage, you've got an overwintering larval stage. Click beetles or wireworms, they're going to be typically a worm at that stage or an immature version of that beetle, and that's what does the damage. And they can burrow into the soil pretty as deep as they need to, as long as it's not a really heavy clay compacted soil. They can move around very easily.
They're creepy and they're crawling, and they can decimate a crop. We're recapping our conversation about insects in corn on the Ag Now Roundup. Howdy, welcome to the Ag Now Roundup. My name is Dave Deacon. There's a lot of wind right now, and with that wind, it's a great way for pressures to move from one state to the other. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about insect pressure in corn, and so we thought we would recap those great conversations that we had with Dr. C. Brown from the University of Tennessee and Ashley Dean with Iowa State University Extension. And if you just can't get enough of insect pressure in crops, then you need to check out the Red Dirt Agronomy podcast, where we recorded an interview with Dr. Ashley Ferris with Oklahoma State University about the natural way to impact some of the predators across the southern Great Plains. You can find a link to that on our website, agnowtv.com. But first, before we dive into insects, let's take a look at the weather across the Ag Nation with meteorologist Matt Makins.
Matt Makins here with your Ag Now weather. Let's get to it first off with some of the hazards that may be coming through. I'll touch on some of these hot weather hazards for the south at the end of the video, because we're going to see some flash drought conditions kicking in for the south. In the meantime, though, throughout the weekend and early next week, heavy rainfall is going to move over the high plains of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and far northeastern corner of Wyoming. That precipitation will spread out, but that'll be extremely heavy there. Also some flooding occurring as we have some snow melt, some additional precip in some of the mountain valleys to the northwest. Strong wind is going to be a problem over the four corners that will lead to not only continued rapid drying and drought growth, but also a wildfire danger, a concern of that. We'll have some severe weather throughout the central plains from Nebraska down through Kansas into Oklahoma. Be mindful of that severe weather risk, especially the 6th into the 7th of May. And then we'll have some isolated flooding here throughout the central plains as well with that very heavy rainfall. So we're definitely into that spring season where we're watching out for these thunderstorms, the severe weather risk, the winds, the fire danger. It's a classic spring package here in that hazards outlook. Let's focus on the soils. This is a look at the soil temperatures and the shallowest layer recorded. So all these red dots that are expanding and moving north with every week we do these Ag Now weather reports, those are temperatures of greater than 60, so the soils are warming up. And throughout most of the corn belt, we have a lot of orange dots there, and that's going to be 50 to 60 degrees. And then north of, we're still just below 50, but warming up quickly. So the soils are warming up, and in cases where they're so dry, we could use some moisture, obviously. Let's take another look at the soil moistures. Around Iowa, we've had some improvement, and that improvement does continue. But the soils are still technically drier than normal, still a drought footprint there, could use more water, and there is more on the way. Down throughout New Mexico into southern Colorado, not much water on the way, so drought will remain there. But for the northern high plains here where we're getting some of that heavy moisture, that's why it's considered more of a risk to have that heavy precip, because it's falling on relatively wet soil, so it may lead to some ponding and lots of runoff with that water. Let's talk about the timeline of the storm activity for the next 10 days. And this animation will walk you through every storm as it crosses the country, also Mexico, and also Canada included. But a series of storm systems will be popping up over your neck of the woods and sliding on through. Kind of the quieter areas will be California, Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, and the southeast will also be relatively quieter than the rest. Most of the storm flow will favor the central U.S., almost as if you draw a belt right through there for the central U.S. will have that storm activity. Let's talk about how much moisture is going to come with these storm systems as they pass through. So again, over the next 10 days, so we're looking through May 12th, here's a lot of water, especially in this region right in here. As those storms fire up, potentially severe dangers there, they move to the north and east, and with them carrying lots of water. There's that dry area for the southwest and drier, relatively speaking, throughout Florida. There's that bullseye of heavy water up into Montana, into parts of the Dakotas and Wyoming. And for these areas, we are from 1.75 inches to 2 inches and higher totals. It's a lot of water for the time of year for that area, but that does extend into the prairies of Canada. Valuable water for their grazing, their crops, their crop prep. But this bullseye of water here is so widespread. Let's zoom that map in. We're starting around central and northern Texas, so around Dallas and close to it through Oklahoma. And that broad area, all of these reds you see on the map represent at least 2 inches, if not approaching 3s and 4s or 4s and 5s. And around Paducah or anywhere else where there's going to be really strong thunderstorms, isolated totals of 6 or more inches will be possible during the next 10 days. It's a lot of water. What's left of snowfall? Well, not much. We have some of that in the Rockies, and we'll get a couple of feet of snowfall there in the central to northern Rockies, and some hints of snow across Canada, but we're starting to run out of snow season here. Not to say it's done yet, but we certainly are running limited on the number of days for snow. Let's turn back to that hazards map, but again, there's this area of heat that's going to build in far south Texas, Gulf Coast states, Florida. It's going to be abnormally warmer than normal temperatures. It's going to last maybe a week or so, and it kicks in as we go throughout next week. The issue here is how we may see some flash drought being promoted. If you haven't heard the term yet, flash drought, it's getting a little more traction with some of the ag meteorologists, ag climatologists, the government. It represents when we see a sharp rise in temperatures and that drought, the dryness at the same time. Culmination may bring some troubles there. I think the biggest issue would be around central Florida to dry out more rapidly than others. But thankfully that does not last too long. We'll get some cooler weather and some more moisture in that direction later in May. Speaking of which, let's take a look at May's moisture here in a recent social media post I put out there just a couple of days ago. All right, let's look forward. Here's a look at May, and the precip areas that were of interest are going to be the green and blue areas. Notice they get a little thinner as you go forward in time, and then we start to bring in some of those oranges down to the south. So early on in May, we have a lot of moisture for the plains, shrink it down to mostly the central and northern plains by mid-May, and then later May, we start to shift everything northward and dry things out a little bit. So May in total is looking like this. Central to northern plains favor for moisture, and we start to bring in some drier conditions around Florida and the Gulf Coast. Again, hurricane activity, something like that may upset this apple cart, if you will, but overall it looks like drier for the south, move that moisture up to the north. And with that, that's today's Ag Now Weather Report. We'll see you next time.
And of all that weather, the wind is still blowing down the prairie. Well, thank you so much, Matt. As many producers know, you can put all of your heart and soul into a crop and then have it damaged by insect pressure. That's why this week we're taking a look back at some of our interviews from the past couple weeks regarding those pesky insects. And that's why we're heading back to Tennessee to talk with Dr. Steve Brown with the University of Tennessee Extension as we kick off our recap about insect pressure. So take me through the rest of the season. What should producers be scouting for as the crop progresses towards harvest?
So typically, and what I tell growers is pretty much with BT corn, essentially, BT corn is more or less taken over the planting acres, and right. So our earliest, the biggest gamble that we face is getting corn out of the ground. Once you get corn out of the ground, BT pretty much takes care of the rest of it. So once we get out of early season, you're looking at knee-high corn, potentially. The biggest issue that we face if you're in non-BT is going to be corn borers. Pretty much is going to be the most yield-limiting insect we're going to see is going to be corn borers. And so, guys, typically we have a threshold that we recommend prior to tassel or at tassel. You can do it based on traps or you can do it based on scouting for eggs. And so corn borers are I would say the most economically yield-limiting pests that we have in our non-BT corn that our growers face. Corn earworm is going to be kind of a secondary pest. It's not yield, so corn earworm is not yield limiting, at least for us in the Mid-South. And so it's one of those pests that it looks bad, it chews on kernels in the ear, but in the reality of the situation, unless you're planting corn in June or ultra late. If you plant corn in the recommended time window that we have in the Mid-South specifically, or in Tennessee, you may get some tip feeding, you may get some kernel feeding by corn earworm, but you're not going to really see a significant decrease in yield, or at least a yield that we could potentially measure with statistics. Because my colleagues in Mississippi conducted a lot of research on this several years back, and it takes anywhere from, I believe, an average of 30 to 40 kernels per ear on every ear in that field to equal a measurable yield loss that we can see with statistics.
Wow.
And so,
Wow.
that little bit of tip feeding or even a little bit of kernel nibbling that these corn earworms are doing, realistically, it looks bad, but are you going to lose yield? What the data says no. So that's typically where we go. I mean, stink bugs can become an issue in there, but stink bug, I haven't seen too many stink bug issues in corn in my career. I know they're there. And if you go to the east in like North Carolina, or you go to the south in Mississippi, stink bugs can become more of a problem, especially when the ears and you're getting to right at the vegetative stage. The ears are, fixing to go into tassel. The ear's about 2 inches long. You're getting kind of that bulge. If stink bugs come in at that time frame and they start feeding on the ear, then that can cause what we see, a cow-warmed ear or malformed ears. That's direct yield loss, but those seem to become fewer and farther between. So,
what kind of treatment window is there for these? Because I know after a certain amount of time, you're going to be getting into potential damage to the actual plant. How far into the maturity process of the corn plant can you actually treat for these?
For, say, corn borers?
Right, yeah.
So typically we're going to, about once we hit tassel to anywhere till about R3, we're going to see, once you hit dent, you're going to be past susceptibility stage. But the most critical time frame there is about that tassel shot. So once you hit tassel, roughly that's going to be your really important stage. And what we see, you can still make a crop with corn borers coming in corn. The issue is we have lodging. And so it's still going to make an ear. It's still going to, you can get some tunneling through some cobs in very bad years. Mm-hmm. But based on our threshold that we have in Tennessee, that tassel shot is going to be really the important stage for controlling corn borers. But the reality is, and where we are with BT, is that the vast majority of our acres outside of our refuge acres are going to be BT. And BT is still extremely effective for corn borer. And so we have no instances, and we monitor for this, no instances of BT resistance in any of our corn borer populations in Tennessee. We really don't see it in the Mid-South in general. And so it's good that our BT corn that we have is still very effective for corn borers.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. C. Brown with the University of Tennessee Extension, for going on with us and telling us about some of the insect pressure in the volunteer state. This last week, we headed to the great state of Iowa, where we learned about insect pressure on the western side of the Corn Belt. With Iowa State University Extension's Ashley Dean. Take us through the year, maybe some of the insects that producers across Iowa and the western Corn Belt may see throughout the growing season of the corn crop.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many. Insects are always going to be in crop fields, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll rise to economic levels that we need to do something about. But there are a couple that people in Iowa routinely look out for. And one of the most common ones is corn rootworm. So corn rootworm are beetle larvae that are feeding on the corn roots. And so that's impacting nutrient and water uptake. But also, if they're consuming a majority of that root system, it makes those plants really unstable and they fall over, which is what we call lodging. And this is a pest that is persistent in Iowa. It overwinters. And if people are planting corn continuously, so really any more than just 1 year of corn, those populations can build up really, really quickly and cause significant yield losses for farmers.
Iowa is a large state, and the corn crop, planting and growing moves from the south to the north. Do you see insect pressures that may vary from one part of the state to the other?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. They're usually, like you said, we're warming up a bit sooner in the southern part of the state and later in the northern part of the state. So even pests that we can see throughout the entire state, we see them at different times, usually separated by 2 or 3 weeks. So
Wow.
farmers in the southern part are usually looking for certain insects much sooner than folks in the north. But then there are some that, for example, Japanese beetle, that's something that I think a lot of people are very familiar with. It's a big, shiny beetle, and it's very recognizable, but actually it doesn't occur in every area of Iowa, which has surprised me a few times for some reason, even though I know this. But that's a pest that is more prominent in some of the southern counties, and especially in areas where our cities are, like Des Moines and Ames and things. But then in like Northwest Iowa, I have never seen a Japanese beetle, so people don't really worry about issues with Japanese beetle there.
That's pretty amazing that such a small insect can impact a certain part of the state. Have you seen the emergence of any insects over the past 5 years, 10 years that may have not historically been there?
Oh, that's a really great question. We have seen some new soybean insect pests. I know we were talking about corn for the most part today, but we have seen some new soybean insect pests. So one in particular is called the soybean gall midge, which is really, really interesting. It's a brand new species known to science, and it's only known to occur in I think it might be 8 states now,
Wow.
7 or 8 states in the Midwest, which is very interesting. We could probably spend like a whole session on soybean gall midge. But I would say one thing that I think people have not historically thought about very much, but that I've seen a lot more in the past 3 or 4 years, and perhaps it's because we've had a lot of drought. We've had persistent drought conditions in Iowa. I've seen a ton of stink bugs.
Interesting.
And I've seen them like all season long. And stink bugs aren't new, right? We've had stink bugs forever, but I've seen them a lot more in corn and soybeans than I have in the past. And so that's something that I've been talking about a little bit with farmers. Just, watch for them, look for them. Maybe you weren't concerned about them in the past, but if populations are really high, they really can cause a lot of injury directly to the yield-bearing parts of plants, which can be quite concerning.
One of the great things about universities throughout the land grant system, there are researchers, extension folks, always listening to the producers and trying to find out answers to their questions. What's some of the research that Iowa State is doing for the producers in the corn world?
Oh, well, the not in our lab at Iowa State. I work in Dr. Aaron Hodson's lab, but Dr. Aaron Gassman does a lot of work for corn rootworm, and this is really directly related to many of the challenges that we have with corn rootworm. We have quite a few management options available for corn rootworm. That's the one that I told you is one that's persistent. It causes a lot of yield loss because it's consuming roots. But we have BT hybrids. So those are transgenic hybrids that express a toxin that's specific for corn rootworm. And those were effective for a really long time. But throughout much of Iowa, those BT hybrids are not working as well as they used to. So we have resistance problems. And so Dr. Gassman's lab does quite a bit of work testing for resistance, but also testing as many new products as possible to try to get answers to farmers for this pest that's really, really destructive across pretty much the whole state. And then I think of things like soybean gall midge, which is a new pest in soybeans, not corn. But we have collaborated on tons of projects to try to get an answer for this, because it's a pest that just straight up kills plants. And we don't see that too often, especially in soybean in Iowa. I don't know too many pests that can just straight up kill plants. So we have been working very hard to try to find answers for that. So we've done many, many studies, product efficacy evaluations, host plant resistance studies. We're collaborating on some biological control studies, just the whole gambit, like everything you can imagine. We've tried to like hit it hard to try to get answers for growers.
It sounds like producers will have a very busy early season. What are some of the things that producers need to be thinking about as the corn plant grows, maybe towards the later part of the season?
Yeah, this is one that I think is really important to touch on, because farmers are so busy, right? And later in the season, like once there's an ear on the plant, they're gearing up for harvest. There's a lot going on. But I think it's important to scout later in the season, because it's really important to protect that ear. So if we've gotten it to the point where we've developed an ear on that plant, we've protected it so that it can, I think it's wise to spend some time trying to identify any pests that might be directly attacking the ear. This is not something that people think about too often, I don't think. And typically we only get questions about ear feeding pests after the feeding is done and the insects are gone, and people are like, what happened to my ear? And usually we can sort of help narrow that down, but it's really, if you wanted to make management decisions or plan for next year or anything like that, it's really critical to be scouting before those pests enter the ear, because once they're in the ear, they're nice and protected. We can't apply an insecticide that will kill them. So really there's no rescue treatment. So I just encourage people to be looking for caterpillars. So the things I think of are like corn earworm, which can do quite a bit of feeding on a corn ear, and they get squishy and moldy and really, really gross. Fall armyworm and things like European corn borer can all directly feed on that ear. And so I just encourage people to be scouting for that later in the season. Try to control them if you need to before they actually enter the ear, because once that happens, there's really nothing we can do for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ashley Dean with Iowa State University Extension, for going on with us and helping producers kind of take a look at some of the insect pressures in corn across the Western Corn Belt.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
And if you'd like to watch either of those episodes, hop on over to agnowtv.com. And while you're there, you can find a link to the Red Dirt Agronomy podcast, where we sit down with Dr. Ashley Ferris with Oklahoma State University. She's the new extension entomologist, and she had a lot of great information about what she's doing for producers across the Southern Great Plains. You can find that link at agnowtv.com. We're rooted in research and proven for producers. I'm Dave Deacon for Ag Now.